What if I told you that McLaren found a way to shoot like no one else on the grid, using an engine that technically doesn't break the rules, but also can't be copied by any team? Because what the FIA has just revealed after the Japanese GP not only explains the unexpected return of McLaren, it exposes a legal loophole in the Mercedes engine that is giving a brutal advantage on the track, an advantage that has an expiration date, but that could decide the championship before disappearing. And now the big question is, how does this trick really work, and why are the rest of the teams completely trapped without being able to do anything? The Japanese Grand Prix not only left us a surprising result, it left us a clear signal that something did not fit with what we had seen in the first races of the season, because McLaren went from being a completely beaten team without reliability, without rhythm and practically out of combat, to becoming one of the most explosive cars from the moment the lights went out in Suzuka. And this was not a progressive improvement or a natural evolution, it was a radical change that became evident from the first laps of the weekend, especially at one point. Very specific thing that set off all the alarms inside the paddock: the start. What we saw with McLaren in Japan was different. It was not simply a fast car on the straight or efficient in the curve, it was a car that had an initial acceleration capacity that was completely out of the ordinary, an immediate reaction to the turning off of the traffic light that allowed it to gain positions or defend itself with an ease that we had not seen even in the dominant teams. And this in Formula One is no coincidence, because the start is one of the most controlled and studied moments of the entire race, where every thousandth depends on the power delivery, the behavior of the engine, electrical management, and how all of this is synchronized with traction. And this is where the real conflict begins, because while the analysts and the teams were trying to understand what was happening, the FIA already had on the table an investigation that had been brewing since the first races, a suspicion about the behavior of the Mercedes power units that did not fit with the theoretical data of the regulations. And Japan was the scenario where everything became evident, because McLaren, as a direct customer of Mercedes, was exploiting exactly that characteristic in real race conditions, showing a performance that was not only superior, but was also inconsistent with what others manufacturers could achieve with similar architectures. The key point is something that normally goes unnoticed by the average spectator, but that actually defines a large part of the performance of an engine: the compression ratio, a variable that according to the 2026 regulations is strictly limited when measured in specific conditions, but that Mercedes has been able to interpret in a completely different way, designing an engine that does not behave the same when cold as it does in real operating conditions, which means that when the car reaches its optimal temperature on the track, that engine is generating more power than, in theory, it should allow the regulations without directly violating them. This changes absolutely everything, because we are not talking about a minor adjustment or an incremental improvement, we are talking about a structural advantage that directly affects the way the car accelerates, especially in critical moments like the start, where each fraction of additional power translates into meters gained in the first seconds. And that is exactly what we saw in Japan with McLaren. A perfect execution that not only depended on the driver or the setup, but on a mechanical base that was operating at a different level than the rest. And the most worrying thing for their rivals is that this is not something they can copy. It is not an aerodynamic piece that can be redesigned in a few weeks, nor a strategy that can be replicated in the next race. It is a completely different engine philosophy, based on materials, thermal behavior, and an interpretation of the regulations that requires time, development, and an investment that simply cannot be improvised in the middle of the season, which leaves Ferrari, Honda, and Audi in a chasing position with no real tools to match that advantage in the short term. Meanwhile, the FIA has confirmed that this situation is legal under the current interpretation of the regulations, but has also made it clear that it will not be for long, announcing changes to the way this variable will be measured to definitively close this technical window, making the upcoming races critical terrain where Mercedes and its customer teams, especially McLaren, can make the most of this advantage before it disappears. And that's how we got to this point, where what seemed like a simple performance improvement in Japan becomes something much bigger, a story of engineering, interpretation of the regulations, and perfect timing, where McLaren has not only returned to the fight, but has done so by relying on a factor that the rest cannot touch, at least for now, and that is what is really changing the balance of the season. But if all this already sounds complex, what comes now is even more delicate, because the FIA not only confirmed that this advantage exists, but practically explained why no one else can achieve it, at least not at this point in the season. And that is where the story takes a much deeper turn, because we are no longer just talking about performance, we are talking about a completely unequal technical war. To understand this, you have to go a step further, because the concept that Mercedes has developed is not simply an improvement in engine efficiency, it is a complete reinterpretation of how it works within the framework of the regulation. using materials with specific thermal expansion properties that modify the internal behavior of the engine when it reaches real operating temperatures, causing the internal geometry to change enough to directly alter the effective compression ratio, taking it to a level higher than that allowed in static conditions, but without breaking the standard at the exact point where the FIA was measuring. This is key because it means that any other manufacturer that wants to replicate it cannot do so by simply adjusting parameters. It needs to completely redesign its power unit from the base, change materials, redesign cylinders, modify internal tolerances, and, above all, validate all this without compromising reliability, something that in Formula One not only takes months, but is limited by development regulations, costs and engine homologation that prevent radical changes in the middle of the season. And this is where the most frustrating factor for rivals comes in, because although now everyone knows what is happening, they have no real room for reaction. They are trapped in their own architectures, in decisions they made years ago during the development of these power units, which turns this advantage of Mercedes into something practically unattainable in the short term, creating a gap that cannot be closed with progressive evolution, but requires a complete conceptual reset. Meanwhile, McLaren becomes the big beneficiary of all this because not only does it have access to this technology, but it also arrives at the perfect time, just after having solved its initial reliability problems, which means that they can now exploit the full potential of the engine without the limitations that we saw in Australia or China, and that completely changes its position within the championship, going from being a team in crisis to one that can directly attack the leaders. But the most interesting thing is how the FIA has reacted to this situation, because instead of intervening immediately, it has opted for a deferred solution, allowing this advantage to continue to exist for several more races before applying a new measurement criterion that eliminates this interpretation of the regulations, which in practice creates an extremely valuable competitive window for Mercedes and its customer teams, a kind of countdown where each point they add now can be decisive. When this advantage disappears, this makes every outing, every race and every battle on the track much more important than it seems, because it is no longer just about who has the best car in general terms, but about who can best take advantage of this technical anomaly before it is permanently closed. And in that scenario, McLaren has a unique opportunity to establish itself as a real contender, relying on an advantage that the rest simply cannot replicate. And now we reach the point where all this stops being a simple technical curiosity and becomes a possible turning point in the championship, because what the FIA has allowed, even temporarily, has created a scenario that is rarely seen in modern Formula One. A clear, identified, confirmed advantage, but impossible to neutralize in the short term. Because while Ferrari, Honda and Audi continue trying to understand how to close that gap without being able to touch the core of their engines, McLaren and Mercedes are in a unique position. Not only do they have the advantage, but they know exactly how much time they have left to exploit it, and that completely changes the way in which they approach the next races. It is no longer about managing a long season. It is about maximizing a specific moment, attacking with everything while the regulations still allow them to operate in that gray area. And this is where Japan's departure makes even more sense, because it was not just a good reaction, it was a demonstration of what this concept can do when everything works correctly. It was proof on the track that this advantage is not theoretical. It is real, it is measurable, and, above all, it is decisive in key moments where positions are gained or lost that later define entire races. But the most dangerous thing for its rivals is that this is not limited to a single situation, because if the engine can offer that extra at the start, it can also make a difference in restarts, in wheel-to-wheel duels, in traction zones where every horsepower counts, which makes McLaren a much more aggressive car, much more difficult to attack and much more effective when it comes to capitalizing on any opportunity on the track. Meanwhile, the FIA has already set a date for the end of this story. It has decided to close this interpretation of the regulations by changing the way in which this critical engine variable is measured, but it has done so without immediately intervening, which in practice leaves an open window where anything can happen, where each race before that change becomes an unrepeatable opportunity for McLaren and Mercedes to accumulate points, build an advantage and, in the best of cases, condition the championship before the balance is restored. And that brings us to the great unknown that defines this whole scenario, because when that advantage disappears, when everyone returns to play under the same real measurement conditions, we are going to discover what the true order of the grid is. We are going to see if McLaren can stay at the top on its own merit, or if this momentum has been the determining factor that allowed them to get into the fight. But by then, it may already be too late for the rest. Because if Japan has made something clear, and what the FIA has revealed later, it is that in Formula One the one who evolves the most does not always win. Sometimes the one who best interprets the regulations at the exact moment wins. And right now that team is McLaren. And now I want you to tell me something very clear in the comments. Do you think the FIA acted too late by letting this advantage exist for several races? Or do you think Mercedes was simply smarter than everyone else? Because what is happening with McLaren is not a coincidence, and it can change the entire season. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.